what is the exact difference between raising a child to be, successful and raising a child to be an actual structural asset to society?
Oh, that is, I mean, that's the core question, isn't it? Because we throw the word success around literally all the time.
Right. Constantly.
But if you stop to actually examine the mechanics of that word, our modern definition almost universally involves some form of systemic extraction.
Yeah, like pulling things out for yourself. You want your child to get the highest grades, right? And then gain admission to the most exclusive institution.
Exactly. Capture the most lucrative position, accumulate the most resources. The whole architecture of modern success is predicated on what you can pull out of the system.
It's totally extractive. But today, we are attempting something completely different with this deep dive.
We really are. We're establishing an entirely alternative paradigm for human potential and legacy.
And to do that, we're relying on a deeply analytical framework provided by the 20th century scholar Ghulam Ahmad Parvez,
Yes, specifically looking at his lecture on a section of the Quran, Surah As-Saaffat, verses 100 to 122.
which covers the really well-known narrative of Abraham and his son Ismail.
Right. But our mission today is to essentially strip away all the centuries of accumulated mysticism and folklore.
And the theological assumptions, too. We want to examine this text purely as a blueprint for rational, socioeconomic system design.
To pull that off, we really have to understand the specific methodology Parvez is applying here.
Yeah, because he's not looking at this the way most people do.
Not at all. Parvez operated on this premise that over centuries, the original, highly practical language of the Quran was just buried.
Buried under what exactly? Like cultural stuff.
Yeah, under layers of Persian mysticism, feudalistic cultural norms, and ascetic philosophies. His whole project was to excavate the root meanings of the Arabic terminology.
So he's treating it less like a book of spells and more like a socioeconomic manual.
Exactly. He approached the text not just as a guide for personal spiritual ritual, but as a comprehensive constitution for building a functional, equitable society.
Which totally shifts how you read it. When he looks at the story of Ibrahim, he's not looking for a fairy tale about a guy who hears a magical voice in the clouds.
No, he is analyzing the historical and structural account of a man trying to establish a brand new societal order.
And that distinction is just so crucial before we even look at the specific prayer Ibrahim makes in verse 100.
Right. Set the stage for us. Where is Ibrahim at this point?
Well, he's reached a stage in his life where he needs someone to carry on his work. He's getting older, and the text tells us he makes a request to the universe, to God, for a son.
But the specific Arabic word he uses to describe the kind of son he wants is really the key here.
Yeah, the word is salih. And I know that historically, and in most common translations today, salih is translated as righteous or pious.
Right, which carries a ton of baggage today.
It really does. Frankly, when people hear the word pious today, they imagine someone fundamentally disconnected from the real world.
Yeah, like a monk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A monastic figure.
Yeah.
Someone who retreats to a mountaintop, avoids all societal friction, prays constantly, and just maintains this state of personal, isolated purity.
Which is the exact opposite of what a massive system disruptor like Ibrahim would actually need in a successor.
Right. Why would he want a hermit?
He wouldn't. So Parvez dissects the linguistic root of Salih, which is connected to the concept of salahiyat.
And what does that root actually imply in classical Arabic?
It implies capability, potential, and the act of rectifying or making something structurally sound.
Okay, so it's about fixing broken things.
Yes, aligning components so they function correctly within a larger mechanism. In a rational framework, a Salih individual is not someone who isolates themselves in prayer.
Right.
A Salih individual is someone who possesses their full inherent human capabilities and actively deploys them to maintain the structural integrity of the community.
So they're a productive, contributing gear in the machinery of society, actively working against extraction and corruption.
Exactly.
I have to pause you there, though, because framing a child or any human being purely as a structural asset or a contributing gear, it sounds incredibly utilitarian.
I can see how it sounds that way, yeah.
I'm just struggling a bit with the coldness of that definition. Doesn't that sort of instrumentalize human life?
Well,
It almost makes it sound like Ibrahim is ordering a specific piece of factory equipment rather than asking for a human connection.
that is a very natural modern reaction to have. But we need to look at the historical and political context of who Ibrahim actually was to understand why he frames it this way.
Okay, so let's dig into that. He wasn't just existing in a vacuum.
Not at all. He emerged in ancient Mesopotamia, specifically in the region of Ur or Chaldea, right during the reign of Nimrod.
And Nimrod's society was, well, it was basically a massive temple economy, right?
A massive extractive temple economy. The religious establishment and the political monarchy were entirely intertwined.
So church and state were essentially the exact same business.
Yes. The elite priestly class essentially legitimized the rule of the king, and in return, the religious structures were used to extract wealth from the common people.
Through offerings, sacrifices, all those complex rituals.
Exactly. Now, the primary source material notes something really important here. Ibrahim was actually born into the family of the head priest.
Oh, wow. So he was the insider of all insiders.
He was the direct heir to this entire extractive apparatus. He was in line to inherit the ultimate position of privilege.
Meaning, he could have spent his entire life extracting value from the labor of the masses without producing anything of structural value himself.
Precisely. He was the heir apparent to the ultimate monopoly.
You know, the source text has this fantastic way of illustrating this dynamic. It describes the religious elites of that era as men who essentially handed the horns of the cow to the political rulers.
Right. The politicians hold the horns.
Yeah, the politicians hold the cow steady, while the priests themselves sit underneath and just milk the cow dry.
It's a perfect analogy. They took on zero political accountability, yet they reaped all the economic rewards of the social structure.
And Ibrahim's entire historical significance is rooted in his absolute rejection of that specific monopoly.
He doesn't just reject it either. He actively dismantles it.
Right. He challenges his father, who manages the temple idols.
He challenges Nimrod, the ultimate political authority, and he physically breaks the idols in the temple.
Which, when you think about it, was not just an act of religious vandalism.
No, it was a direct attack on the economic center of the state. He is forcing the society to confront the irrationality of their own system.
And consequently, he becomes a massive system disruptor.
The ultimate disruptor. And because of that, he is persecuted, thrown into the fire of public condemnation, and eventually forced into exile.
So he leaves behind all his inherited wealth, all his status, his entire comfort zone.
All of it. Just to establish a new society based on rational truth rather than superstitious extraction.
Okay, so let's fast forward to his old age. He spent decades tearing down a corrupt system and laying the foundation for a rational one.
Right.
He looks at his life's work, and he realizes he needs succession. Which brings us back to my earlier pushback about the factory equipment.
Ah, yes, the utilitarian critique.
Yeah. When he asks for a Salih, he isn't being cold. He is recognizing the immense fragility of what he has built.
He knows how precarious it is.
Right. If he asks for a son just to have a family or asks for an heir just to rebuild his lost wealth, the entire rational project collapses the moment he dies.
The survival of the system dictates the requirement. He cannot afford a prince.
He cannot afford someone who views the new society as just a vehicle for personal wealth.
No, he explicitly requires someone with a saliyat, the inherent cultivated capabilities to actually operate the system.
The focus on Salih shifts the paradigm of legacy entirely, doesn't it?
Completely. Legacy is no longer about genetic continuation or wealth transfer. It is about finding individuals who are structurally aligned with the health of the system itself.
Which establishes this fundamental socioeconomic necessity. A sustainable societal structure just cannot survive if its primary actors are focused on extraction.
It requires operators who find their ultimate value in their structural contribution.
You know, if we translate that requirement to the organizations we try to build today, the implications are severe.
Oh, absolutely. Think about how we evaluate leaders today.
Even how we raise our own families. We are almost exclusively focused on acquiring extractive skills.
We teach people how to negotiate the best salary,
how to outmaneuver their colleagues for a promotion, how to position themselves for maximum visibility.
Right. But we rarely evaluate them on their salahiyat, their fundamental capacity to reinforce the structure of the organization, even when it offers no immediate personal reward.
Which is such a massive blind spot. And that leads directly to the next critical phase of the source material.
Right. So Ibrahim has made this highly specific request for a capable, structurally aligned operator.
And the text then tells us the response he receives from the universe. It says he was given the glad tidings of a son who was Halim.
And this is where the socioeconomic reading really starts to challenge our basic assumptions.
Seriously. Because if you are a massive disruptor like Abraham, and you know your successor is going to face deeply entrenched, powerful enemies.
Enemies who want to destroy your rational system, yeah.
You would assume the necessary trait for that successor would be raw courage. Like you'd want a warrior.
A fighter.
Right. Or at the very least, you would want someone with sheer Machiavellian intelligence who could just outsmart the corrupt elites.
But the text doesn't announce a brave son or a genius son. It announces a Halim son.
Which is traditionally translated as forbearing.
Right, and Parwaz dedicates significant analysis to this specific word, Halim, because the traditional translation has severely degraded its meaning over time.
Yeah, in common parlance, when we say someone is forbearing or mild-mannered, we are usually describing a state of passive weakness.
We're describing someone who absorbs insults or poor treatment simply because they lack the physical power to fight back.
Or they lack the social capital or the courage. They are quiet because they are literally incapable of being loud.
Exactly. And Parwaz vehemently rejects this interpretation in the context of the Quran.
Why? What's his textual basis for that?
Well, he highlights that Halim is frequently used as an attribute of God in the text.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it is logically absurd to describe the creator of the universe as weak or incapable of retaliation.
Okay, I see that. But I want to push back on this concept of forbearance anyway. Because even if you strip away the connotation of weakness, forbearance still implies taking hits without returning them.
Yes, it does.
If you are building a movement that opposes a massive corrupt empire, doesn't your successor need to be aggressive?
You'd think so.
If they just absorb the blows from the system, how is that different from just being a doormat? And how does a doormat sustain a revolution?
The difference lies entirely in the underlying capacity of the individual.
Okay, explain that.
Parwaz uses a very specific, grounded analogy drawn directly from the desert environment of the text to illustrate the true nature of Halim.
What's the analogy?
He describes a fully grown, mature, working camel.
Okay. A camel.
Right. This is an animal packed with immense physical power. Dense muscle, incredible stamina. Imagine this massive beast sitting on the ground, calmly chewing its cud.
All right, I'm picturing it.
Then a group of young children run over to it. They start pulling the camel's ears, trying to climb up its neck, poking it with sticks, and just generally causing a massive annoyance.
They're getting absolute pests.
Exactly. Now consider the physical reality of that moment. That camel possesses the sheer explosive kinetic force to stand up, shake those children off, and trample them into the sand in a fraction of a second.
It possesses absolute lethal power in that specific scenario.
Yes, but it does not use it. It calmly continues to chew its cud. It absorbs the annoyance. It tolerates the friction of the children.
And the key distinction here is that the camel isn't tolerating the children because it's afraid of them.
Not at all.
It is tolerating them because reacting to them is beneath its purpose.
Exactly. The camel holds its power in reserve until that power is actually required for its true structural purpose.
Which is to carry hundreds of pounds of cargo across an unforgiving, lethal desert environment.
Right. A weak animal or a nervous or incapable animal would panic and lash out at the children because it feels constantly threatened.
Because it doesn't actually have the capacity to handle the annoyance.
Precisely. A Halim individual operates from a state of overflowing capability. They are so secure in their power and their ultimate purpose that they do not need to prove their strength in every minor skirmish.
Or every interpersonal conflict.
Exactly. They possess the psychological robustness to absorb difficulty and navigate systemic friction without retaliating destructively.
Wow, that reframes the idea of forbearance entirely. It is not the absence of power, it is the absolute mastery of power.
It's power held in check by purpose.
Which answers my own earlier question about why you wouldn't want a warrior. If you introduce an operator into a complex system who has immense courage and aggression, but zero forbearance,
they will burn the system down from the inside.
Yeah. They will view every minor disagreement as an existential threat. They will turn every logistical hurdle into a holy war.
And eventually, the structural integrity of the movement will just collapse under the weight of their constant battling.
And on the flip side, if you introduce an asset with brilliant intelligence, but no forbearance,
you end up with an extractive manipulator.
An incredibly smart person who cannot tolerate the daily grinding friction of human cooperation. So they inevitably figure out how to optimize the system for their own personal benefit.
Exactly. They entirely avoid the hard, unglamorous work of actually sustaining the structure.
Courage without forbearance is destructive.
Mm.
Intelligence without forbearance is extractive.
The reason the text specifies Halim is because only this deep psychological robustness actually sustains a system over the long term.
You know, I think the best modern analogy for this, and something that really crystallizes why Parwes focuses on this socioeconomic functionality, is the concept of an industrial shock absorber.
Oh, I like that. Walk me through it.
If you look at heavy machinery, like a high-speed train or a massive mining truck, these vehicles generate terrifying amounts of kinetic energy.
Right. Massive force.
And they operate in environments full of resistance, bumps, and literal friction. If engineers build that machine out of purely rigid materials, if every single component is just hard, brittle steel designed to never yield, the machine will destroy itself.
Because it can't handle the dynamic stress.
Exactly. The rigid components transfer the kinetic energy directly into the structural frame. The vibrations from the road will cause microfractures, and eventually the entire chassis will shatter.
Just from the combination of its own forward momentum and the resistance of the environment.
Yes. So to solve this, engineers install massive shock absorbers. These are components specifically designed to compress, to take the hit.
To absorb the sudden kinetic jolts from potholes or uneven tracks.
Right. And they dissipate that violent energy as heat. The shock absorber is doing the heavy lifting, so that the main chassis of the vehicle remains completely stable and can continue moving forward at high speeds.
That's brilliant.
And when you look at a shock absorber, you don't think it's the weakest part of the machine just because it compresses.
No, you recognize it as arguably the most resilient, crucial component that allows the entire operation to exist.
And that is exactly what a Halim individual does in a socioeconomic system.
They take the kinetic hits of human frailty, logistical failure, and political friction, and they dissipate that energy before it can fracture the organization.
It is a profound realization about organizational design. When you are building a team or attempting to scale a movement, the most critical element is not the visionary who charts the course.
And it's not the aggressive closer who wins the battles either.
No, it is the Halim operator, the shock absorber. Because in any long-term endeavor, catastrophic friction is inevitable.
When the structure is under maximum stress, the Halim individual is the one who keeps the chassis from snapping in half.
And this brings us to a really critical transition in the narrative arc of Surah As-Saaffat.
Let's track where we are. Ibrahim has asked for a structural asset, a Salih son.
The universe has responded by announcing the acquisition of an asset with the exact necessary psychological profile, a Halim son, Ismail.
So the system has successfully developed a highly capable, incredibly robust human asset.
But a rational system cannot simply assume the alignment of its assets, no matter how well they have been developed.
No, it has to verify their ultimate commitment.
Which brings us to the most famous and, frankly, the most misunderstood segment of this entire narrative.
The dream.
The dream and the command to sacrifice.
We have to approach this section with extreme analytical rigor, because this is where Parwes's reading diverges most radically from the traditional, purely theological interpretations.
The interpretations that have basically dominated the discourse for centuries. So let's establish the scenario as presented in the text first.
Right. Ismail has grown into a young man. The text says he has reached the age of running with his father.
Implying he is now actively participating in the structural work.
Exactly. Ibrahim then comes to him and makes a deeply unsettling statement. He says, "Oh, my son, I see in a dream that I'm slaughtering you. So consider, what is your view?"
I really want to focus on the specific phrasing there, because it is the linchpin of the entire rational argument Parwes is making.
Yeah, emphasize that. What does he actually say?
Parwes points out that Ibrahim does not walk up to his son and say, God has issued a divine decree ordering me to commit human sacrifice, and I'm here to execute it.
Right. He explicitly states, I saw in a dream.
That distinction is paramount. In the vast majority of traditional narratives, sermons, and classical commentaries, this event is portrayed as a literal, terrifying command echoing down from the heavens.
Ordering a father to murder his innocent child.
Yes, and that interpretation raises horrifying ethical, moral, and theological paradoxes.
It suggests a divine authority that demands the violation of its own fundamental laws regarding the sanctity of human life, just to prove a point.
It's totally irrational.
Parwes argues that the Quranic text itself simply does not support this reading. It was a dream.
And within Parwes's rational framework, a prophet's dream is not a legislative decree.
No. It may reflect their deepest psychological anxieties, their intense desires to serve, or their internal spiritual grappling with the weight of their mission.
But it is not a direct, literal order to commit murder.
Exactly. And the text itself validates Parwaz's interpretation later on.
How so?
When the event concludes, the text quotes the divine response as saying, "You have fulfilled the dream."
Oh, wow. It pointedly does not say, "You have executed my command."
Exactly. It acknowledges that Ibrahim took his own internal psychological vision and treated it as the ultimate truth.
So if this was not an external decree, it means this was a self-imposed test.
Yes. Ibrahim interpreted his own dream as a metaphor for the absolute requirement of his mission.
But why? Why would a man who has dedicated his entire life to rationality, a man who broke the idols of his youth because they were irrational, impose such a brutal psychological crucible on himself and his son?
To comprehend his motivation, we really have to analyze the socio-economic and psychological reality of Ibrahim's position at that exact moment.
Okay, let's look at that. Consider who Ismail actually is to Ibrahim.
Right. He is not merely a biological offspring. He is the culmination of decades of struggle, exile, and system building.
He is the Salah and Halim asset that Ibrahim explicitly asked for. He's the only guarantee that Ibrahim's life's work will survive his own death.
In a very tangible socio-economic sense, Ismail is Ibrahim's ultimate project. He is the legacy.
I understand that entirely. For anyone who has ever built something from scratch, whether it's a business, a nonprofit, a political movement, there is a terrifying phenomenon that happens over time.
The attachment.
Exactly. Let's look at a modern founder. They start a company because they believe in a specific principle. Maybe they want to democratize access to information or build a truly sustainable product.
Right. They have a noble mission.
They spend 20 years eating instant noodles, getting rejected by investors, sacrificing their health. Finally, the company hits $1 billion valuation. It is successful.
But then what happens?
The danger is that the founder eventually begins to love the company more than the principle the company was supposed to serve.
The project itself becomes the idol.
Exactly. And that is the core vulnerability of any rational system.
Yeah.
The creator becomes so attached to the mechanism they built that they will compromise the foundational truth just to keep the mechanism alive.
And you have to remember Ibrahim's defining characteristic. He is the breaker of idols.
Right. He destroyed the physical idols of stone and wood in Babylon.
Now, in his old age, having successfully built a new community, he is confronted with the possibility of a far more dangerous internal psychological idol.
The idol of his own legacy. The idol of his deepest personal attachment to his son.
So the dream and the subsequent attempt to fulfill it is the ultimate test of subordination.
The crucible is designed to answer one question. Does the messenger value his project more than the principle he serves?
Is Ibrahim willing to completely dismantle his ultimate achievement, his most cherished asset, for the sake of the higher rational order?
Because if he hesitates, if he decides that Ismail is too precious to risk, then Ibrahim is no longer a servant of the rational principle.
Right. He has become a servant of his own emotional attachment. He is reverted to being an idolater, just of a more sophisticated psychological kind.
The self-imposed test is the only way to verify that the system remains pure.
It's the ultimate stress test.
Let's bring this back to the listener. What is the modern practical equivalent of this crucible? Because we obviously aren't talking about physical violence or literal sacrifice.
No, we are talking about the architecture of absolute commitment.
Right. I think about the political leader who has spent 30 years building a coalition, fighting tooth and nail to gain power for a specific righteous cause.
And they finally reach the peak of their influence.
But then the situational dynamics of the country change. They suddenly realize that their continued presence in power, their sheer dominance over the party apparatus, is actually preventing the cause from evolving.
It has become a liability.
Exactly. Do they have the psychological fortitude to step down? Can they voluntarily sacrifice their own political life, their magnum opus, for the sake of the movement?
And history shows us that almost no one passes that test.
No one. Leaders cling to the project because the project has become their identity.
Or think of the founder of the sustainable company who discovers that their core product requires materials sourced through exploited labor.
The principle demands they shut the production line down, potentially bankrupting the company they love.
Do they dismantle it, or do they rationalize the exploitation to protect the asset?
The Ibrahim narrative insists that the willingness to sacrifice your dearest attachment for the larger order is the absolute prerequisite for leading a rational system.
And we really cannot overlook Ismail's role in this dynamic either.
No, we can't. When Ibrahim presents the dream and asks, "What is your view?" Ismail does not panic.
He doesn't beg for his life. The text records his response. "O my father, do what you are commanded. You will find me, God willing, among the patient."
Ismail, functioning as the fully realized Halim asset, willingly agrees not to stand in the way of the principle.
He validates his father's commitment. He proves he is not a pampered prince who demands that the system protect him at all costs.
He demonstrates that he is a structural asset, ready to be entirely subordinated to the mission.
It is a chillingly rational dialogue.
It really is. The father basically says, "I must subordinate my attachment to you to prove the integrity of the system."
And the son replies, "I understand. I will not become the friction that prevents the system from operating."
From the perspective of organizational design, it is the ultimate flawless proof of concept. Both the creator and the successor are perfectly aligned with the principle over their own existence.
Which brings us to the climax of the narrative, and the point where Parwaz delivers his most aggressive critique of traditional interpretation.
Okay, let's get into it. The willingness to destroy the ultimate attachment has been established. Ibrahim and Ismail go to the location. Ibrahim lays his son down.
He prepares to make the ultimate physical sacrifice to prove that no idol remains in his heart.
And then what actually happens?
Well, if you grew up hearing this story in a traditional setting, you know the fairy tale ending.
Right at the absolute last second, an angel swoops down from the clouds, holding a massive magical ram.
Some of the more elaborate classical commentaries even suggest this ram had been grazing in the pastures of paradise for 40 years, just waiting for this moment.
That's so specific. So the ram is physically substituted for the boy on the altar, the ram is slaughtered, and everyone goes home happy.
Parwaz eviscerates these interpretations.
How does he break it down?
He points out, with intense textual scrutiny, that these stories of magical heavenly rams descending from the sky are simply not present in the Quranic text.
Wait, really? They aren't in the text at all?
No, they are imported myths. Over the centuries, early commentators drew heavily from older Talmudic traditions, regional folklore, and existing mythologies.
And they unconsciously wove those dramatic elements into the Islamic exegesis.
Exactly. Parwaz views this not just as a textual error, but as a catastrophic philosophical downgrade.
He essentially asks the scholars of his time, why are you taking a profound, sophisticated lesson in socioeconomic structural design and reducing it to a campfire magic trick?
And his frustration is entirely justified.
Absolutely. If the conclusion of the story is just a magical intervention, what is the actual takeaway for a human being trying to build a society?
That God plays a terrifying psychological prank on an old man and then gives him a sheep to barbecue as a consolation prize.
It strips the entire narrative of its gravity. It turns a blueprint for human potential into a fantasy novel.
So if we discard the magical ram, we have to look at the actual words used in the text.
The Quran states that Ismail was ransomed with a zivin azim, which translates to a great sacrifice.
If the great sacrifice wasn't a heavenly sheep, what was it? How does a purely rational system explain this substitution?
To understand the zibhin azim, you have to ask a fundamental question about the mechanics of a rational system. Does a perfectly rational system waste its most capable, heavily vetted, historically rare assets?
No, absolutely not. That would be the definition of systemic failure.
You don't spend decades acquiring and developing the perfect Salih and Halim operator just to destroy them on a rock to prove a philosophical point.
Exactly. The rational system does not require the destruction of human potential. It requires its deployment.
The moment the willingness to subordinate personal attachment to the principle is absolutely proven.
The moment Ibrahim demonstrates that Ismail is not an idol, and Ismail demonstrates he is willing to be subordinated.
The physical destruction of the asset becomes completely obsolete and unnecessary. The system doesn't want the asset dead.
Therefore, the ransom, the substitution, is not a downgrade to an animal. The substitution is a massive structural shift in how that human asset is deployed.
This is the turning point of the entire analysis. This is where the socio-economic reality replaces the theological myth.
We have to look at what actually happens to Ismail after this event, historically and geographically.
At the time of this test, Ibrahim and his family are based in the region of Palestine, the Levant. This was the Fertile Crescent.
It was lush, green, agricultural, and essentially the center of civilization and relative comfort.
Ibrahim had spent years there building a successful movement. If Ismail had simply stayed in Palestine, he would have been the heir to a comfortable, established, flourishing enterprise.
He would have inherited the socioeconomic equivalent of a stable, profitable corporation.
He would have lived a life of relative ease, managing an existing structure.
But that is not what happens. Instead of a one-minute physical death on an altar in Palestine, Ismail was saved for a lifetime of socioeconomic sacrifice.
The true Zibin Azim, the great sacrifice,
was that Ismail was taken from the green, comfortable empire of the Levant, and he was permanently deployed to the uncultivated, brutal, barren valley of Hijaz.
the area we now know as Mecca. The geography of Mecca is crucial here. The Quran explicitly describes it as an uncultivated valley.
We're talking about a place with no natural water sources at the time, no agriculture capacity, no existing trade economy, and no political infrastructure.
It was absolute, unforgiving wilderness. Why on earth would a rational system deploy its most valuable asset to a wasteland?
It is a matter of strategic geopolitical positioning.
How so?
If you want to establish a new ideological headquarters for humanity, a central hub like the Kaaba that is dedicated to a rational, non-extractive system, you cannot build it within the borders of an existing agrarian empire.
Right, because if you build it in Egypt or Mesopotamia, the local monarchy will immediately co-opt it, tax it, or destroy it.
Exactly. You have to build it in a place so devoid of natural resources that no empire wants to conquer it, but strategically positioned along trade routes so that the message can disseminate.
It requires building a civilization from absolute zero.
So the sacrifice was never canceled. It was converted.
Converted from an acute, one-minute physical death into a chronic, lifelong deployment.
Ismail didn't lose his life to a knife. He gave his entire life, day by day, year by year, sweating and bleeding in a desert to build a systemic hub from nothing.
And that is precisely why the text elevates it by calling it a great sacrifice.
Parwez argues, quite convincingly, that giving up your life in a single adrenaline-fueled moment of intense fervor is actually much easier than enduring 50 years of grinding, relentless, unglamorous hardship for the sake of a mission.
The substitution was not a magical sheep. The substitution was an upgrade from a momentary loss to a lifelong mission of civilization building.
You really have to let the weight of that sink in. The rational system does not want you dead. It wants you fully utilized.
It puts you through a crucible to test your psychological attachments, to verify that you are not guarding your own comfort or hoarding your legacy above the mission.
And once you pass that test, your reward is not a vacation. Your reward is the hardest possible assignment.
Because you are the only one capable of surviving it. You possess the salahiyat, the inherent capability to build structure.
You are halim, meaning you have the psychological shock absorbers to handle the friction of the barren valley without shattering.
Therefore, the system deploys you to the point of maximum leverage and maximum difficulty.
This entirely reframes how we view testing and outcomes in our own lives, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. We have been conditioned to believe that if we pass a difficult test, if we prove our loyalty to a company or a cause, the universe or management will reward us with ease.
We think, I proved my commitment, now give me the corner office, the massive bonus, and the easy accounts.
Right. But in this rational systemic view, passing the test simply proves your capacity for heavier loads.
It connects perfectly back to the camel analogy. You proved you can sit calmly and hold your power in reserve while the children pull your ears.
Excellent. That means you're ready to be loaded with 1,000 pounds of cargo and sent across the Sahara.
The reward for capability is responsibility.
I find that intimidating, but also incredibly ennobling. It elevates the baseline of human potential.
It suggests that you aren't just here to consume resources, secure a comfortable retirement, and fade away. You are here to be a structural pillar in the architecture of civilization.
When we step back and look at this entire narrative arc, from the initial prayer to the final deployment, we can see how Parwez has completely transformed it.
It is no longer a collection of disjointed theological miracles. It is a cohesive, highly advanced design principle for rational commitment and system building.
The architecture of that principle is undeniable once you view it through this socioeconomic lens. It begins with the fundamental demand for a productive asset.
Seeking out individuals who possess the salahiyat to contribute structurally rather than extractively.
It recognizes that capability must be paired with psychological robustness, requiring the asset to be halim so they can absorb systemic friction without causing destructive fragmentation.
It acknowledges the inevitable danger of psychological idols, requiring the ultimate crucible to verify that neither the creator nor the asset values their own legacy over the underlying principle.
And finally, it culminates in the rational deployment of that validated potential, shifting the asset from an environment of comfort to an environment of maximum necessity.
Demanding a lifetime of constructive labor.
It is a breathtakingly complete model. It challenges us to look beyond the superficial interpretations we've inherited.
It demands that we stop treating historical texts as passive mythology and start reading them as functional, rational manuals for human organization.
You have to strip away the magical rams and the monastic pieties to find the structural truths underneath.
Because if we fail to do that, we lose the utility of the text entirely. We are left with comforting stories that demand nothing of us structurally, while the systems we actually live in continue to degrade into extractive monopolies.
Which leaves you with a final, lingering question to mull over as you go about your week. Look closely at your own life, your career trajectory, the organizations you are actively building, and the people you're attempting to mentor. Are you spending your finite energy building precious, fragile idols meant to be protected at all costs? Or are you actively developing capable, robust assets that you are entirely prepared to subordinate to a higher, rational principle?